So before we get into the subject of today's video, which is a revisiting of something we have already covered but with more information that has come out since then, I have two quick announcements. The first one being, after the absolute rip-roaring success of Euro Truck Simulator 2, which was an honoured thing from a Twitter poll, I'm going to do more of it in the near future, okay? I know what you're all thinking. Oh wow, so much more excitement. I know, I really do. And you're all welcome. Second, to the very lovely person, so kind, I really am grateful, who donated to me on PayPal to buy a replacement snowball, which I am now currently using. Thank you. I'm not going to read your name out, in case you didn't want that. But you know who you are? Thank you. I figured I'd stick with a snowball as I have used one for 2 years anyway, and only recently was I encountering issues. That and the setup for what I already had was quite expensive, and it seemed redundant to throw it all away, considering how expensive it was. Blue shock mount, blue pop filter, and some marginally more expensive swing arm. Now, the subject of today's video, as I mentioned, was a revisiting of a case we've already covered, where, as many of you know, a large number of Pakistani men, typically called Asian grooming gangs, I know that they are from Asia, but as I've stated many times, it's far too broad. Pakistani were arrested, charged, investigated, prosecuted, and then convicted. However, some were not, because at the time, their sentences were not issued. But the rest had been issued to the point where they were collectively up to over 200 years in prison. As I pointed out when I initially covered this, the sentences were somewhat inconsistent and didn't quite stack up in my mind. There was an inconsistency when some were connected to drugs, but also rape. It made no sense to me. The update to this would include the rest of those people who were convicted but had yet to be sentenced, being sentenced for a collective additional 101 years, which is, of course, considered by many a massive success. I know many will say the sentences are not substantial. They are not enough. I know. And we all know this man, while claiming to be a Sikh convert. No, you really weren't. You just did that to get away with blue murder because you're a prick. A prick that gives good Muslims a bad name. I know what I said there almost seemed alien, but there are some. Now, as many websites didn't, or media outlets, did not cover this additional information, we are stuck with the Daily Mail. You may not like it, but I tried to find something related to the social services add-on article that we are also going to look at, but there aren't any websites that cover it, so it was quite tricky to get differing sources. Rotherham grooming gang are jailed for a total of 101 years after sexually assaulting young girls, including victim who was passed around by 100 Asian men by age of 16. A gang of 6 men, so this is the additional 6 men, not the other 20, has been jailed for a total of 101 years. These faces were in the original video I covered, but I do recall going through them and their sentences had not been announced, because they had yet to be sentenced. I assume because there were so many, they couldn't simply just say life without parole. The men targeted girls who were easy to exploit because they wanted to be loved. And was that the excuse given for wanting to use children as play toys? Fantastic. Sexually abusing them in parks, abandoned buildings, and secluded locations while they were hardly going to get the parents' permission to go to their house and pork them over the dining room table. The offence is committed against 5 girls under 16 in the Rotherham area between 1998 and 2005. Their abusers, all Pakistani men from Sheffield and Rotherham, were convicted of offences including rape and indecent assault. Well, it's nice to know their charges carried with it a little variety. So here we have Nabil Khurshid, Mohammed Imran Ali Akhtar, Asif Ali and Tanweer Ali, Ikhlaq Yusuf and Salah Ahmed El Hakam, who got 22 years, 22 years, 10 years, 14 years, 20 years and 15 years respectively. The girls said in statements how the men had destroyed them and that their childhood had been taken from them, which is why we take such interest in not having children abused. It's why when this is covered and we find out it goes back decades, we find out so many people have had a very horrible experience and how their country has let them down. The race card being used to perfection, to the point of actually silencing real victims of real crimes as opposed to perceived crime. Another reason I don't care for the misogyny. One of the victims told the trial how she was made to have sex with at least 100 Asian men by the time she was 16, and another described how she was gang raped in a forest and threatened with being abandoned there. At Sheffield Crown Court today, Judge Sarah Wright told the men, each in your own way perpetrated, facilitated or encouraged the sexual abuse of these young girls. Each of the complainants in this case were groomed, coerced and intimidated. Each of them was groomed, each of you groomed, which goes back to where they said they did it because they wanted to be loved, being absolute claptrap. You can have been in no doubt that the complainants were vulnerable in the extreme. You were clearly not immature, evidenced by the fact you all indulged in cynical manipulation and exploitation of your victims, which showed a maturity well beyond your chronological age. It's a tad sneaky, don't you think? Almost like they were raised to be a snake. She added, they continue to suffer considerable trauma, unsurprising, and will continue to suffer throughout their lives as a result of your actions. This actually raises a rather interesting question. We have a compensation service, and I've mentioned it a few years back, where a male victim of rape couldn't get compensation from the CSCS, is that what it's called? I'll put it on the screen now, what it's called. And this body ascertains how much that person is entitled to based on the crime they experienced. I don't know how they get the money for it, but I am curious as to whether or not those who have suffered these truly heinous crimes can claim any compensation with the convictions having happened. I know the obvious argument of, but do they want to or do they just want to move on comes up. But quite frankly, I think each and every one of these victims deserves to be paid. They have suffered, and considering who it was that let them down, because you can say yes, they were scared to not speak up, but we have many cases where those that were afraid to speak up, or did speak up, those that did speak up were fobbed off. So I am quite curious to see how that progresses, if at all. During the gang's trial, prosecutor Michelle Colburn told how the victims were local girls with unsettled home lives. It's cliché of a groomer to find someone vulnerable, because they are easy to manipulate. As they were sentenced, prosecutor Michelle Colburn said the offences had a massive effect on the victims' lives, as we all know. In victim impact statements read out by Miss Colburn, the court heard how one of them, who was aged between 13 and 15 at the time, had been destroyed by the abuse. Another victim, who was gang raped in the forest where defendants Nabil Khashid and Ikhlaq Youssef, along with a third man, broke her. Miss Colburn described this as not a gentle act but a planned group attack, based on some of the facts that they moved people to different locations to then abuse them. It is premeditated. It is not done out of love, nor is it done out of and I vaguely recall a guy getting off a train somewhere saying, my balls are full and need to be emptied. It's not that either. It's a case of, she looks like I could abuse her. Sorry, love her. Fuck the age. One of the victims was forced to terminate an unborn child after a rape and was left severely psychologically damaged. She wrote, they made me think abusive behaviour was normal in any relationship. Isn't that a sorry state of affairs? To grow up so miserable you think that's what happiness is? That's genuinely what it is to take away from a child. Replace what could be happiness with misery and tell them that is the norm. It isn't the norm. Yes, okay, we have poverty in our country, but not this kind of... No, this is a line you don't cross. Which is why many say you all, every one of you that gets convicted of a child sex offence, belongs in a prison cell smaller than the average prison cell, with a bed and a toilet, and nothing else. Many would argue your human rights should be taken away. Now the article continues to talk about how a series of British towns and cities have been hit by revelations of Pakistani sex gangs in their midst, which included the 9 men of Rochdale, which we talked about with the very, very good Muslim Newcastle, 17 men and 1 woman, Oxford, group of men who abused teenage girls in a vehicle they called the Shag Wagon, jailed for a total of 90 years in June, Bristol, 30 Somali men, I wonder if they used the I'm a pirate pickup line, Aylesbury, 6 men jailed in 2015 for grooming vulnerable underage white girls between 2006 and 2012, Peterborough with 10 men convicted of child sex crimes, Telford, as that was an earlier mentioned this year, one with Sarah Champion, who got vile abuse for raising awareness on this, and Huddersfield with 20 more sex abusers, but there are many more in many cases still being investigated. Now earlier I mentioned an article about social services, where they dismissed child victims of the UK's largest Asian grooming gang because, and this is the excuse given, because the houses were middle class. They had nice kitchens and conservatories. Well, based on the time frame when some of these attacks happened, it can safely be assumed they entirely were given by the housing associations and councils as a means to house those economic migrants that came to this country, depriving people who already lived here of decent properties. They were not middle class by any stretch of the imagination. This article is a damning statement for social services in this country, who I will happily spend an entire video reaming, if you want me to do that, by the way, and possibly go into this article even further and show some of their massive flaws. Let me know in the comments below. So, this recap aside, I hope everyone has a lovely Sunday, and thank you all for listening.